Hello again, my name is Adam St. John. I'm a fire protection engineer with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms out of the ATF Fire Research Laboratory. In the first video installment, we talked about Mark Falkenhand and his line of duty death with Baltimore County Fire Department and how ventilation flow paths affected the final outcome of that incident. Now today we're going to look at 3 other line of duty death incidents, and we're realizing as engineers and as scientists that these flow paths have been killing us for quite some time. They're very dangerous, but we know how to recognize them now, and we know how to address them tactically. So we're going to look at these other incidents in detail and analyze these flow paths. So the first flow path incident we're going to look at is from quite some time ago, 1999, the Cherry Road incident out of DC. It killed 2 firefighters and severely injured another firefighter. This was certainly a flow path issue. It involved ventilation, and we're going to talk a lot about ventilation and how to properly conduct ventilation. And the key is coordination. We want to wait to ventilate until we have a means of putting water on the fire, a means of absorbing the energy that's released by that fire. Leisure World happened in 2005 here in Montgomery County. We had a firefighter get burned in that incident. That was also a flow path issue. We had an opening low in a basement level apartment, and we had an opening into the stairwell. That firefighter was burned in the stairwell as a result of that flow path. Did we use the terms flow path back then? We were just starting to, but now we really understand how these flow paths develop, how they work, and how to address them tactically. We'll look at the San Francisco line of duty death, and this was another basement firefighter. Again, 2 firefighters died in the stairs with full PPE with a charged hand line, and they were never able to call a mayday. So what happened in that incident? In the San Francisco incident, it was a single pane of glass that failed as a result of the fire that meant the difference between life and death for those 2 firefighters. We already looked at Baltimore County. We'll take a look at Prince George's County. That report was released recently. What happened to those firefighters? Again, a working basement fire. They were burned near the stairwell, working on the floor above. Another flow path issue. At this point, it's a broken record. So what we looked at in the last video was this basement flow path. Remember, anytime you have an opening low and an opening high, which is almost every fire we go to, you're going to have a flow path develop. Here, this is Baltimore County, your rear slide or your front door, flow path up. Again, in Baltimore County, this flow path killed Mark. An opening low and an opening high. What do you need to recognize as a firefighter? The first thing you need to recognize, if you see smoke moving all in one direction, you're putting yourself in between where the fire is and where the fire wants to go. How do we address these flow paths tactically? Well, putting something to block that flow path is key. We'll look at a few cases ATF has investigated where we've used doors and where firefighters have used doors, and UL has evaluated doors to see how will these protect us. If you block that flow path, then you limit the amount of oxygen to that fire, the fire size decreases, and you can protect yourself for a significant period of time. We'll also talk a little bit about vent, enter, search. So, a quick overview of these 3 line of duty death incidents. The first one was Cherry Road. It happened back in 1999. It killed 2 firefighters, firefighter Phillips and firefighter Matthews. Both firefighters were caught in a unidirectional flow path at the top of the basement stairs. These photographs are from the DCFD report, and it looks a lot like Baltimore County. That's not a coincidence. This is side Charlie of the building. This is the basement level. We see lots of fire. We see no smoke. Why? This is the inlet. It's down low. This is the outlet on side Alpha, the front of the building. We see floor to ceiling smoke. This is the outlet. Do we have extremely high temperatures? Absolutely yes. Do we have lots of fuel? Absolutely yes. Do we see any flames? No. Why? Because by the time the flames make it throughout the entire building, by the time the heat and the smoke make it that far, they run out of air. So we have temperatures that are approaching flame temperatures, upwards of 1,000 degrees, but we don't have flames. So if you're in this environment, you enter, there's zero visibility, the environment changes, the temperatures increase, but we don't see that visual indication. These guys, 2 crews at the top of the stairs with 2 hand lines, and they burned to death almost in place. We'll look at that and we'll understand why. The next incident, we're talking almost a decade later, over a decade later, it was a very similar incident. 2 firefighters were working above a working basement fire, and one window changed. The ventilation changed. The fire broke out a window on the fire floor. The flow path changed, flowed around them, high velocity, high temperature gases. It killed these 2 firefighters. We'll look at that in detail. The final incident we'll look at is Prince George's County, 57th Avenue. It happened in February of 2012, and 2 firefighters severely burned. These firefighters almost died. We talk a lot about our gear, our PPE. Why does it have to be so good? Is it too good? And the answer is no, at least in my opinion. These firefighters, if they didn't have such good gear, they would have died in this incident. So we'll talk about what happened here. Again, they're working above a basement fire. They create a ventilation flow path. They're caught in those conditions. In this case, they put out the fire during the Mayday situation and conditions improved. That's a key piece of information we haven't had before. So again, in this case, they are caught in a unidirectional ventilation flow path from the basement. So these are 2 examples of ventilation flow paths. These have flames coming out in one direction, unidirectional flow from the floor to the ceiling. Now, no firefighter would enter a situation like this where the flames are coming out. Now, this is the exact same vent 10 seconds earlier. I think a lot of firefighters would enter this situation. Right now, it's just smoke from floor to ceiling, but 10 seconds after this photo, it turns into this, which gets a little bit more ventilation. So we'll go over what to do about these, some tactical considerations as well. Let's start off by looking at Terry Road. This happened in 1999. It killed 2 firefighters, experienced firefighters, from Engine 10 and Engine 26 in DC. This is the front of the townhome. It was built into a hill. On side Alpha, it was 2 stories. On side Charlie, it was 3 with a basement exterior entrance. When they arrive on scene, they have just the front door vented. And essentially, when they open that door, it's a bi-directional flow. As soon as that basement door is vented by a crew, everything changes. Both firefighters are caught in a unidirectional flow path at the top of the basement stairs. Now, back then, NIST did an analysis of this fire. And what that analysis showed is that the fire intensified significantly after the basement slider was vented, forcing high temperature gases in excess of 1,500 degrees up the stairs at over 18 miles an hour. What happened specifically in this case? When they arrived on scene, they're following their typical basement protocol. What do they have? They have 2 hand lines, a primary attack line, and a backup line. They had full PPE at the top of the stairs. Now, when this fire was first started, and it started in the basement in the ceiling, ATF participated in this investigation. The whole house was sealed except for the front door and a window on the first floor. So when they arrived on scene, there was smoke from floor to ceiling, like we always see, and this fire was ventilation limited. What does that mean? We talked about it before, but when the fire starts, it produces smoke. When that smoke fills the room from floor to ceiling, that fire begins to starve for oxygen. When we arrive on scene and we ventilate, we're giving a fire that has plenty of fuel, plenty of heat, the third leg of that fire triangle, ventilation. In this case, when they ventilated this basement door, that fire grew in size, doubled and tripled in the amount of energy it released, the size of the fire. The more we vent, the bigger the fire is going to get unless we put water on it. In this case, they vented and the temperatures increased dramatically. We cannot ventilate a building until we're ready to absorb the energy released by that fire. Back to this incident. They pop the front door, they make their way to the top of the stairs. When they open that door, they have bi-directional flow. What does that mean? Well, we have a fire in the basement, but in order for that fire to get air, the air comes in along the floor, which we always see. The smoke's coming out the top, air is coming in. You have 2 flows competing for one opening. It's that bi-directional flow. It's inherently inefficient. What do I mean by that? In order for this fire all the way in the basement to get air, it's got to travel through the front door, all the way down the stairs, around the corner to this fire. That fire reacts to that little bit of oxygen and releases heat. That heat travels all the way back upstairs and out the front door. Limited oxygen, limited fire size. Are they hot? Certainly. Can they see anything? No. But they're in a situation that's okay because this cold air is also coming in along that floor. The idea is the same SOP we had in Montgomery County until just a few months ago is that they're going to hold the fire at the top of the stairs. So what happened? Remember, this fire, the only thing it's missing is ventilation. Plenty of fuel, plenty of heat. They have a hand line standing by here and a hand line standing by right behind them as well. So we talked about the smoke layer being from floor to ceiling. The fire size is determined by the amount of ventilation. Venting does not equal cooling in almost every fire that we run. If the smoke layer is from floor to ceiling, and we'll talk about this a lot more in the third video, the more you vent, the bigger the fire is going to get unless you put water on it. And you do have a certain period of time, a certain grace period, depending on a number of factors. And we'll address all that in the third video. But what happens in this case? In this case, a crew inside Charlie ventilates half of the rear slider. They break that glass, and then they break the other glass, the other pane of glass on that basement level. When they do that, they give a fire that's starved for ventilation and opening down low. And now you have a large opening down low right near the seat of the fire. The fire is going to respond to that. It's going to give off a lot more heat. So now that we ventilate the basement, we had a small fire. Now we have a lot more air coming in. We have a lot more fire, and that flow changes. So now our outlet, which we said is almost always up high, is basically the firefighters are in between where the fire is and where the fire wants to go, following that outlet. Now the question is, if you're in this situation, why don't you realize that you're in a bad spot? Why don't you open that hand line? Why don't you call a mayday? Why don't you leave? And the answer is, a lot of times, just like we saw in Baltimore County, you don't see the flames. You enter, it's a working fire, you have zero visibility. We're all used to that. But now, this fire size increases. When they vented this rear slider, they saw the fire increase, but they never said anything on the radio. So this crew, when they entered, had zero visibility. They still have zero visibility, but they're in temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees. So they sit there. They don't realize they're in a bad situation. From floor to ceiling, you're talking 15 miles an hour. We talked about what we called convective heating. Just like cold air in a wind chill cools you down on a cold day, hot air moving past you at a high velocity will heat you up very quickly as well. That's exactly what they're in, a convective oven. That air is blowing past them. The guy in front and the guy behind end up dying in this case, just a few feet from where they are. That flow path ends up impacting him. It bounces off the ceiling and rolls around and burns him also. The guy in the middle ends up surviving with severe burns. Here's a model that NIST did over 13 years ago. They identified this flow path, and we're seeing it over and over and over again. With these arrows pointing up the stairs show us that this air is traveling at 18 miles an hour up the stairs at an excess of 1,500 degrees. Is it faster than you can run? Sure it is. Is it faster than you can crawl? Absolutely. But what's important is that velocity is going to heat you up very, very fast. And if you don't see the indicators of flashover, if you don't see flames, but you're in temperatures close to flashover, you don't react to that. You don't open your hand line. You don't try to leave until it's too late. We'll talk about how your gear protects you and why it becomes saturated with this energy in a second. So straight from the report, high velocity conditions, and the firefighters attempted to exit. All of a sudden, they realize they're in a bad spot. The gear works by absorbing energy. By the time they realize they're in a bad spot, they try to leave. So they try to go out the same way they came in, just like people do in fire situations. What do? We want to get out of there the fastest way possible. Usually we follow the hand line, but in this case, you're following that flow path the entire direction. In most cases, especially in Baltimore County, if you deviate from that flow path to any other dead-end part of the building, the temperatures decrease. Human nature tells us we want to go out the same way we came in. That's the same way that heat is traveling. That's the flow path. You're following the flow of that hot air. So NIST, back in 2000, identified with these flow paths that they're extremely high heat, they're high velocity conditions. These firefighters had full PPE, a charged hand line, and they collapsed within feet of where they were. We're going to see this again in San Francisco. No Mayday was called. They never opened their hand line. They never pushed an orange button, and we'll go over why. Their gear was saturated with energy. It hit them all at once. We'll talk about that. This is currently the weakest link in a lot of situations. Our means of sight, our means of seeing, and our thermal protection of our lungs. Our respiratory system is often the first thing to go. It's the weakest link in our PPE. We'll talk about why and what we're doing to change that. In this case, there's indications of face piece failure, and we'll see that a lot in these cases. Mark Falkenhand, the first thing that went was his face piece. That was the first thing that killed him. We were able to show that with a medical examiner. Moving on from DC, let's look at San Francisco. This happened 12 years later. It was also a double line of duty death. 2 experienced firefighters, full PPE, a charged hand line, die in the stairs. Never call a mayday, never open their hand line. What happened? This is side Charlie of the building. Again, a working basement fire. The ventilation changes. A single pane of glass fails. What does this mean? It means you might run 9 basement fires, and out of all 9, that pane of glass stays intact. You're going to make those stairs. It's going to be a hot fire, but you're going to put that fire out. But on that 10th fire, if that pane of glass fails, it's going to be almost impossible to make those stairs. The temperatures are too high. Let's look at this case. This is the side Charlie photograph before the glass fails, and this is after the glass fails. You can see significant fire development, significant heat release rate. So when they arrived on scene, what did they see? The occupant sees a vacuum cleaner. It ignites the curtains inside of the room. They try to put it out. They call 911. This is a photograph. You can see the garage doors open, very light smoke showing. Does anybody think that this is going to be a fire that's going to kill 2 firefighters? Absolutely not. You can see on side Charlie, the back side of the building, very light smoke showing, and the fire actually starts over here in the corner of this room. We look inside, there's smoke from floor to ceiling. This fire is ventilation limited. Most of the fires we run are ventilation limited. That smoke layers from floor to ceiling, venting does not equal cooling. The more you ventilate, the bigger the fire is going to get. So the entrance level is on this level here. You go down the flights of stairs to where the fire started. We have that inefficient bidirectional flow. In order for the air to vent this fire down here, it's got to go all the way down the stairs, and then it heats up that air. It comes all the way back up. It's relatively inefficient. So what happens in this case? When the fire starts, that smoke fills the entire room. The fire becomes ventilation limited. The fire size is determined by the amount of air it has. That air has to come all the way through the garage, down the stairs, it becomes heated up, just like Cherry Road. So they pull their hand line, they start advancing down the stairs, and then one thing changes. In this case, it was the fire venting the glass itself. We can say, hey, we'll just tell our crews not to vent in a basement fire situation, and that's great if you're trying to make those stairs, but the fire can induce glass breakage itself. We'll talk about why in a second. So when they arrive on scene, they enter down the stairs to the sublevel 1 where the fire is. And at first they had that bidirectional flow. That means the fire size is relatively small, and that means that cold air is keeping them cool when they're on their bellies trying to make the stairs. When they're down low, the temperatures are cooler. Once that flow path changes, you can get as low as you want, and the temperatures may not be any cooler, at least not significantly cooler. So when they come down, halfway down the stairs, all of a sudden, one pane of glass fails. The difference between life and death is a single pane of glass. You can see when one pane of glass fails, the fire size increases. It responds to that ventilation. When the fire size increases, it causes the next pane of glass to fail, and then the next pane, and the next pane, and that turns that bidirectional flow into unidirectional flow. You have a significantly larger fire that's releasing more energy, and from floor to ceiling, it doesn't matter how low you get, you're not going to be able to escape those temperatures. So in this case, we talked about the difference between life and death was a single pane of glass. Now, as a fire protection engineer with ATF, we do lots of fire tests in our labs. We'll repeat the same test over and over and over again. We'll use the same fire, the same fuels, the same room, the same model of glass, and we'll see that the times it takes for the glass to fail will change significantly. So if you're entering a basement fire, going down the interior stairs, and there's a pane of glass for an entrance down low, the difference between life and death in your case can be a single pane of glass. The best place to attack that fire is going to be from the lowest point, the inlet to that fire. So the question we always get is, hey Adam, you're saying always use an exterior entrance. What if there isn't an exterior entrance? Sometimes we have basement fires where there's no way, there's no window, there's no door to get down there. Well, if there's absolutely no means of ventilating the basement other than coming down the stairs, and you can't have that unidirectional flow. If this is blocked, then the only way for air to get down there is through the stairs. So we'll look at this case. Back to San Francisco. Prior to glass failure, this is straight from their report. You can see there's smoke from floor to ceiling. They make their way down the stairs. The glass begins to fail. The heat release rate increases and causes the next piece of glass to fail, and the next piece and the next piece. They're in the stairwell when this happens. You can see a minute and 45 seconds after the first pane of glass fails, the entire room is fully involved. Looks again like Baltimore County. It looks again like Cherry Road. What do we see? A lot of flame in the back, because that's where burning is occurring. That's where our fire triangle exists. As you work your way along that flow path, you consume the oxygen, so you have a lot of heat, a lot of fuel, but not a lot of air. If you're in that stairwell, you may not see these signs of flashover that we're typically used to. We may not see rollover. You may not even see flames at all, but you're in a very bad spot. Your gear becomes saturated. This is that bidirectional flow that's inefficient. Air comes all the way down, fuels that fire, comes back out. That fire size is small. After that window breaks, this is what we see, the exact same point in time. A lot more smoke produced. Why? Because we have air coming in the back, smoke coming out the front, just like we saw in Baltimore County, just like we saw on Cherry Road. Let's take a look at the actual stairwell from the case. You can see a lot of thermal damage, but not a lot of fuel. Why is that? All of that energy is coming up from the room on fire below. Nothing in the stairwell is actually burning. It's the gases released from the unit that's on fire. So this was a basement fire, and we know the best way to attack these fires is putting water in the seat of the fire from the inlet. They were inside the stairwell, a charged hand line, full PPE, and they didn't realize they're in a bad spot, probably because they never saw flames. We need to recognize that these flow paths exist and attack these fires from the inlet whenever we can. The difference between life and death is a single pane of glass. Let's look at Prince George's County, Maryland. This happened in February of 2012. 2 firefighters almost died. They were caught in unidirectional ventilation flow path from the basement. It's a broken record at this point, and we need to start thinking about these situations and predicting them. What happened in this case? This is straight out of the report. Shortly after arriving, firefighters forced the front door of the structure, which immediately changed the fire's flow path and fire dynamics by adding a ventilation opening above the fire. This is a picture when they arrived on scene. We know it's a working basement fire. We see fire coming out of a window on side Bravo. The fire was very intense, that it made it difficult to walk between the two buildings. We need to recognize as firefighters that if we open that front door, we're creating an opening above the fire, and we're going to create a flow path. This is something that we need to teach people and get through, because we know there's an opening down low. In this case, there's an opening here, and there's also an inlet downstairs. When we open that front door, we're going to make an outlet. So firefighters entered the structure through the front door, placing themselves above the basement fire and its outlet flow path, which is now the front door. Why is it the outlet flow path? Because it's up high. In this case, wind supplemented that flow path, but the outflow is always going to be through that higher opening. When they arrived on scene, they identified a working basement fire. Their SOP is similar to a lot of other SOPs where they are thinking that they're going to stop the fire, they're going to prevent extension up the stairs by closing the door, advancing with a hand line, protecting a search. We'll talk more about basement tactics in a second. So what happened in this case? The truck crew goes through the front door. One of them does a right-hand search. The other one does a left-hand search. By the time they make it to the door, to shut the door, that's their intentions, they realize the door is burned off. At that point in time, they're experiencing very high temperatures. Why? Because they have a basement fire, a working basement fire. They ventilated a lot. When they opened the front door, the ventilation increased. You have that inlet out back, and all that energy is traveling through the building now. They're putting themselves in the outlet of that flow path, putting themselves between where the fire is and where the fire wants to go. When that happens, that flow path actually causes that door to slam shut. When that happens, these firefighters become trapped inside. One firefighter bails out the window here. The other firefighter is trapped in the back. Meanwhile, inside Charlie, the fire in the basement was burning unchecked until an engine company entered the basement from the rear of the structure and began putting water on the fire. Now, in this case, and this question comes up a lot in Mayday situations, we'll talk more about basement fire tests in a second, but everything that UL has done and everything that we've seen, when you put water on the seat of the fire, the temperatures decrease throughout. They have tried time and time and time again to push flat fire, to influence fire spread with a hand line, and they can't do it. When you apply water to the seat of the fire, the temperatures drop throughout. Now, in this situation, they attacked this fire from side Charlie as this firefighter is trapped upstairs. Temperatures decrease throughout the house by all indications. So when they do that, fire isn't pushed up the stairs. Things certainly don't get any worse, and this firefighter is eventually pulled out through the front. Severe burns. We'll talk about face piece failure and PPE in a second. All that we're saying throughout this entire lesson and the next video is coordinate that ventilation. We absolutely have to ventilate every fire. You can't put out a fire without opening that front door and ventilating to begin with. But we need to wait to ventilate until we have a means of putting water on the fire, absorbing the energy, because almost every fire we run is ventilation limited, and our fuels react faster than they used to. So what we're saying is coordinate that ventilation. When they ventilate, in this case up high, you're not letting the heat out. You're allowing more air to a ventilation limited fire, and that fire is going to respond. That's exactly what happened in this case. When you open the front door, you have more air flowing in, the fire size increases, the temperatures increase throughout the structure. The temperatures on the first floor increases. Why? Because the fire increases. The source of the energy increases as well. It makes sense. The way to put out this fire is not by flowing a hand line, combating the flow path, because you're not cooling anything. You're not cooling the source of the energy. The source of all that energy is down in the basement. Those gases are following the flow path. By the time they get to you, they run out of oxygen. The way to prevent this flow path, to combat this flow path, is putting water on the seat of the fire, and they do that via side Charlie in this case. Now, what we see a lot in these cases, this is where the flow path is. As a human, like we said before, our instinct is to follow that flow path back out. The problem is, a lot of times, that's where the temperatures are the highest. So if we can isolate ourselves from that flow path, go to any of these other rooms, the temperatures are actually going to decrease. Why? Because it's a dead end. There's no airflow that way. The temperatures are lower. In Baltimore County, just 15 feet from where Mark died, there was a kitchen with no ventilation to that kitchen area. The kitchen was always ventilation limited. You could have opened those cabinets and eaten anything out of those cabinets because the temperatures never increased high enough because there was no air back there. So if you get out of this flow path, the temperatures are almost always lower. If you shut a door and block that flow path, the temperatures will decrease very, very quickly. The temperatures will drop. So what do we see? In this case, when the engine company inside Charlie, during the Mayday situation, put water on the fire, it certainly made conditions better. So what were the conclusions that the safety investigation team had from this incident? The first one is this: incorporate a 360-degree survey of environmental conditions as part of your SOPs. What does that mean? It means going around the entire house, figuring out where that fire is. If that fire is below grade, try to attack it from the lowest point. If you create an opening up high, you're going to increase ventilation, you're going to influence fire spread. The second recommendation: develop a department-wide training program that focuses on understanding fire behavior, fire flow paths, again, and how to read interior and exterior smoke conditions. What do we mean by that? Not only is smoke pushing out, but also, what does that opening look like? Is it bidirectional? Is it in two directions? Or is it unidirectional in one direction? If it's unidirectional, that's not a good place to enter. There's always a better place to enter because you have air flowing out, so air has to be flowing in somewhere else. We want to predict fire spread better. We teach essentials, and usually we get 4 to 8 hours of fire dynamics in essentials, and that's not enough, especially for a modern fire environment. So in all three of these cases, these were basement fire scenarios. They were ventilation flow paths coming up from the basement. A lot of areas have or currently had SOPs where they wanted the first two engine company to hold the fire at the basement. The idea is we're going to protect that search. And UL evaluated basement fires systematically. Why? They wanted to give firefighters an idea of a reliable indicator of collapse. What can we experience? What do we look for before a floor collapses? Now, unfortunately, they weren't able to find anything that's reliable, and we'll go over why in a second. Now, I encourage you guys to go to UL's website, which is ul.com/FSRI. They're the ones that have systematically looked at these situations, and you can take hour-long training programs to actually educate you on these situations. Now, here in Montgomery County, floor collapse situations, especially on basement fires, have been a common close call for us. We had in Rockville, Lincoln Avenue, a firefighter fell through the floor into a working basement fire. Luckily, that fire was put out just before he fell through. Company 18's area in Glenmont, we had a firefighter fall through the stairs at Claridge Road. over in Rockville in 23's area, we had a catastrophic floor collapse where an entire crew fell through the floor onto a working fire. We need to understand when we can work above these fires, what do we look for, and what's the best way to address them. Like I said before, many departments have an SOP where they want to protect the search of where the people could be. So the first due hose line goes to the top of the stairs. All the testing that we've done and that UL has done have looked at this and examined that this probably isn't a good idea, and we'll go over why. So let's talk about UL's examination of reliable indications of collapse. The idea that we're going to sound the floor, something a lot of firefighters do. What do? Well, when we walk in, we take our tool, we bang it on the floor to determine how stable it is, how sound it is. And when we do that, we're really testing the flooring material and not the support system below. Why is that dangerous? Well, the beam supporting the floor could be burned away, and we hit it with our tool. All that we're doing is sounding that upper layer of the actual flooring material. So the whole support system could be gone, and it could collapse even though it sounds solid, because we're really sounding the OSB and not the support system itself. What about a thermal imager? If we take a thermal imaging camera and look at the floor, if it looks hot, that could be an indication of collapse. Absolutely. The problem is, because of engineered lumber, because of carpet padding, because of carpet itself, it acts as a great insulator. So just because it looks cool to the thermal imaging camera doesn't mean there's not a working fire below it. It could collapse without any indication, even though it looks cool with a thermal imager. What about floor sag? We'll operate above a fire until that floor begins to feel spongy before it bounces a little bit. Is that safe? No, we're found, especially in full turnout gear and zero visibility, the deflection can be very, very insignificant. You might not be able to notice it, especially near a wall. The biggest rate of deflection is in the center of the room. Usually we conduct our searches along the wall, and there's not noticeable sag before collapse can occur. Now, conversely, if you sound the floor and your tool goes right through it, you don't want to operate on that floor. If you're using a thermal imager and the floor looks hot, you certainly do not want to operate on that floor. If the floor is sagging or spongy, you don't want to operate on that floor. All of those are true, but just because the floor sounds solid or it looks cool or it feels solid does not mean that floor won't collapse. So following that SOP, where you're working above, you're flowing your hand line above a working basement fire, there's no reliable indicators of collapse. So you could fall through to that fire without being able to predict it at all. So let's talk about the SOP of actually using the hand line, staging the first hand line at the top of the stairs. This is a slide from UL's website. I encourage you guys, please visit their site. They have classes on all of these topics that we're talking about, from ventilation to basement fires and everything. We've done some tests, but they're certainly the ones that systematically evaluated these situations. In basement fires, the idea that the first hand line is going to go to the top of the stairs to protect the search and prevent fire spread. And they evaluated how effective these hand lines are at battling these flow paths, and they determined that they don't do very much to combat fire flow and especially smoke spread. So what do we mean by that? Well, if we have a hand line at the top of the stairs, the source of all that energy is the fire at the bottom. That's what's basically making these gases heated, making them buoyant, and going up the stairs. There's not a lot of fuel in that stairwell. If we open our hand line, the most we're going to do is cool 3, 4, 5 feet, the reach of that hand line down the stairs. In the tests that we did at ATF, we got cooling maybe 10 feet down the stairs. We're not doing anything to cool the source of all that energy. On top of that, all those gases are going around that hose stream up into the rest of the house. Typically, in a basement fire, what kills the people on the first floor and the second floor is that smoke. We all know that smoke kills people because of the toxins, the lack of oxygen, and we're not doing anything to stop that smoke spread. What's a great idea, if there's a door at the top of the basement, shut that door. That's going to block that flow path. That's going to result in ventilation limited conditions along the flow path and control the ventilation flowing into the room. That's a great idea, but the hose lines do very little to combat the flow path. Why? Because the fuel, the source of all that energy is coming from the working fire below. The best thing you can do is apply water, making an interior attack through that basement entrance, or even from the exterior. We'll talk more in the third part of this video series, exterior attacks, and why we can't push fire. We'll go over that in detail, I promise. So, what's the other problem with this basement SOP? Well, they said that the path of flame travel may not be the stairwell from the basement to the first floor. What do we mean there? we mean we may be standing here preventing any flames from coming up the stairs, but if the fire started in this corner, the floor may fail over here first. So we may be waiting for the fire to come through and up the stairs, but meanwhile over here, the fire has already come up through the floor through a pipe chase, through some other means of travel from the basement to the first floor. So we can't assume that the first place the fire is going to come from the basement to the first floor is going to be the stairwell. We may sit here for 15 minutes while the fire burns through this other area. It doesn't work. So what about the old idea that the stairwell is the hottest point, and by the time we make it to the bottom, temperatures are going to decrease? Well, all the tests that we've done at ATF, and especially UL's tests, we haven't seen that to be true. What do we mean by that? Well, by the time you force your way down to the bottom of the stairs, the temperatures are hotter. Why? Because you're closer to the seat of the fire. You're closer to where you have that fire triangle, where your heat, your fuel, and your oxygen are mixing. So by the time you make it to the bottom, the temperatures aren't any cooler, which seems to make sense. So we basically show there's no way to predict where and when that floor is collapsed. The hose line does very little to stop the flow of smoke and heat up the stairs. We can't even assume that the stairwell, the open stairwell, is going to be the first path to travel between the basement and the first floor, and temperatures are not any cooler at the bottom of the stairs. The best way to attack basement fires in this situation is to put water on the seat of the fire, whether it's an interior attack through the entrance just to that basement, directly to the basement, or an exterior window. If you don't have either of those circumstances, you can't have that unidirectional flow up the stairs. Basement fires are very, very dangerous, and UL will show, and the tests have shown firsthand, that unless you have a really good reason to operate above a basement fire, you probably shouldn't be there. A great tactic to consider, which we'll talk more about, is vent, enter, search in a basement fire situation. Why? Because you can bypass that entire first floor and go straight to where the people are, probably in their bedrooms on that second floor. We'll talk about that more in a second. We talked about ventilation flow paths, and when they're unidirectional, that they're high temperature, high velocity flow. Now, in terms of our PPE, in terms of our gear, the weakest link in a lot of these cases have been the face piece. What do we mean by that? Our means of sight and our respiratory protection is often the first thing to go. In Baltimore County, in Mark Falkenhand's case, his face piece was the first thing that failed. Here's a picture of Mark Falkenhand's actual face piece. You can see that there's a hole formed on the left side, which is the side facing the fire. When a face piece fails, it's due to the radiation most of the time given off from a fire. A lot of times when we go into flashover cells and flashover simulators at the academy, if you just stare at the fire the entire time, you'll notice crazing of your face piece. That's because it's line of sight. Its radiation is a primary factor in that case. If you look away for a few seconds and look back at it and look away, your face piece won't craze. Those cracks won't form. Why? Because you're blocking that radiation. Here's a picture of the inside of Mark's face piece. You can see bubbling. After the face piece begins to craze, which almost looks like little cracks in the polycarbonate material, then it will begin to bubble before it fails. The problem is a lot of the time in these situations, you have zero visibility to begin with. So you don't recognize that your face piece is failing because you can't see through it to begin with because of the smoke. So you may be in a bad situation before you even realize it because you can't see through that face piece. Even if you can see through it, you can't after it begins to bubble. This is the face piece from 57th Avenue from Prince George's County. Again, the lens has softened where deep crazing occurs. On the inside of the lens, you can see signs where melting has occurred with immediate failure, which would probably follow. What does that mean? His face piece was on the verge of failure in that case. What about Cherry Road? In Cherry Road, firefighter Phillips was found face down without his face piece on. His cylinder was empty, and the face piece was not attached to the regulator. They think in this case, his face piece began to melt and he took it off. There was buckling, blistering, and cracking of the lens material. So we know that face pieces should not be the weakest link as part of our PPE. We need to protect our respiratory system. We need to be able to see. So what has changed through the years? It's not that our face pieces have gotten any weaker. It's not that they absorb energy any faster. It's that our turnout gear has gotten better. It's easy to make turnout garments able to absorb more energy, able to protect us better. We have better clothing materials now, and we also can add more material to them so they can absorb more energy to protect us. So our hoods have gotten better, our pants and our coats have gotten better. However, our face pieces have stayed the same. So before, when we'd start to burn our ears and shoulders, now the first thing we're seeing is that the face pieces will fail. NIST did some very interesting tests where they looked at when and how face pieces fail. We always get the question of how long does it take? What temperature does it take? And the process of heat transfer is very complicated. It depends on the temperatures outside, the face piece. It depends on how much radiation is given off from that particular fire, how much of the face piece is heated convectively by the air traveling past the face piece. What's interesting is every time you take a breath, you're cooling the inside of the glass of the face piece. So a face piece on a breathing mannequin will last longer than a face piece out in the open. This was a test that NIST did to evaluate face piece failure. Now in this case, it takes several minutes for this face piece to fail because the fire is not in direct contact with it. In flashover conditions, a face piece can fail very, very fast. In a training scenario where you're burning for several hours, it may take a face piece several hours to soften and fail. So we can't focus on exact times or situations because there's lots of variables that are involved, but we can look at the mechanisms and the signs of failure. So in this case, the face piece begins to absorb energy, and the first thing we see is crazing, or what will look like cracks in the glass. We can see that begin to form. So in a case where there's not a lot of smoke, and you can see through that fire, you can see crazing. It's not actually a crack, it's just expansion of the outer portion of the face piece lens. You can see these begin to form here. I'm going to pause this for a second. So what's going on? We all realize that when this happens, your face piece is positive pressure. What does that mean? It means the pressure inside of here is greater than the pressure outside. That's done intentionally. We all know that. So if you develop a leak, it's going to blow the smoke out of the mask. So the flow is always from your air tank into the mask out to the environment. So the smoke doesn't enter. As that face piece begins to weaken, what happens is that positive pressure pushes the mask out a little bit, and you take a breath, it decreases the pressure, it pulls the mask in a little bit. So you'll see in real time now, before it was accelerated, that the face piece will breathe in and out, in and out. You can see that the mask begin to bubble slightly, and every time you take a breath, we have that convective cooling along the face piece. You'll watch up in here, a hole will form. Now we've had several cases, from especially line of duty death cases and firefighters that were severely burned, where the first thing they will feel is hot air coming in through the hole that forms. So you're in zero visibility. You don't realize that your face piece is failing. When that hole forms, when you take a deep breath, it overcomes that positive pressure. And when that happens, that hot air hits usually part of their face where that hole is. So we'll watch that process one more time. You can see about halfway through, the face piece will begin to breathe in and out. It's softening, the crazing, and it begins to actually bubble. When it bubbles, then the hole will form. What do we teach in essentials class? Well, if you have a hole in your mask to cover it, to push on it. In this case, if you push on it, it'll probably push right to your head. It's a really, really soft material. So what did NIOSH do? Well, NIOSH worked with a number of organizations to identify cases where face pieces have failed. In fact, they looked at 6 recent firefighter fatalities where the firefighters were likely still on air at the time of the event. So cases where the firefighter died, the first thing that failed was their face piece. And the conditions encountered likely exceeded the performance capabilities of the face pieces. What does that mean? Essentially that they exceeded the performance criteria, the testing standards, and they failed on the actual person. So this is Mark Falkenhand's face piece again. So they reviewed the information, and they were able to show that many of the firefighters involved in the incidents were close to an escape point. What do they mean? They were near a window, they were near a door, where if the face piece remained intact, they may have been able to make it out. So NIOSH worked with NFPA using these line of duty death incidents as justification to update the face piece standard. The new face pieces have increased lens durability, they have increased flame resistance, as well as increased radiant specific performance standards. What does that mean? It means we talked about the face piece failing as a result of that radiant energy impacting the lens. Now they need to withstand that energy better. Increased flame resistance, direct flame impingement to the face piece is improved as well as voice communications. That's also important. If you're in a bad situation, you need to be able to call a mayday and understand that mayday. That was also improved. So with the new NFPA standard, the weakest link, which was our face pieces, are now going to be more durable. They can absorb more energy. Over the years, we said that our turnout gear has gotten better, and when that happens, a lot of firefighters were relying on face pieces to tell them when it's time to get out. When their face piece began to craze, they know they've gone too far. Our hoods have gotten thicker. When our ears began to burn, we used to gum out. Now that our hoods are thicker, we don't realize we're in a bad situation. So is the answer to stop making our turnout gear any better? And the answer is no. If those firefighters in Prince George's County didn't have really good turnout gear, they probably would not be alive. We need our gear to be able to protect us when we're in a really bad situation. So what's happening, especially in these flow path situations? Well, our turnout gear works by absorbing energy. And basically, after a certain period of time, that gear becomes saturated with energy. There's what we call a thermal lag between the outer layer of the gear and the inner layer, which is up against our skin. It's designed to absorb energy at very high temperatures for a certain period of time before it hits our skin. But if we don't realize we're in that situation in 1200, 1500 degree temperatures, then we don't know to get out when that energy transfer process starts. What are we talking about? Well, here's the fire. Here's that outer layer of our gear. If we're in a flashover condition, we see the flames, we recognize we're in a bad spot, and we try to get out. Hopefully we have 10, 12 seconds to get out before we get burned. If we see those flames, if we recognize that, we had that period of time. What we're seeing a lot with these flow paths is you're in a bad spot, you're in zero visibility, conditions change. The temperature increases from floor to ceiling rapidly, but we don't see a lot of flame. Why? Because we're missing that oxygen characteristic. The same thing happened in San Francisco, the same thing happened in Cherry Road, and also Baltimore County. You're in a bad situation, but you don't realize it because you don't see any flames. Your gear becomes saturated. So the outer layer begins to heat up, then the layer up against that, all the way to your skin. By the time it hits your skin, it's too late. Your gear is what we call saturated. It's very, very warm. When we interview people from Prince George's County, what do they say? And people that have survived this says they're in this flow path, and all of a sudden it feels like they're getting stung by 1,000 bees all at once. Why? Their gear becomes saturated. Your gear works very, very well until it's absorbed all of the energy it can absorb before all those layers become saturated. So in these incidents, these firefighters are in full turnout gear. They have charged hand lines, they have radios, but they never call maydays. Why? We talked about it before. A lot of times they don't see evidence of flames. They're in very, very high heat conditions, but they don't see any flames. You read witness statements from people who've been involved in these incidents and have survived. What happens? They said all of a sudden it feels like being stung by 1,000 bees all at once. All that energy is soaked into the gear. It hits you. This is 1,000 degrees, then the next one's 1,000 degrees, the next one, the next one, the next one up against your skin, and you start to get burned. As soon as you start to get burned, it happens very, very rapidly because you're in a bad situation to begin with. You make it a few steps. Usually when you make it a few steps, you continue to be in that flow path. You don't have time to push an orange button on your radio. You don't have time to open the hand line. All you want to do is get out of there. Why? Because you're burning through your gear. And when you follow that flow path all the way along, you're staying immersed inside of that saturated environment. Your gear is very, very warm. It can't absorb any more energy. So in these situations, people are making it a few steps, and then they drop where they are. Why? Their gear could become saturated all at once. All they want to do is get out of there. They follow that flow path the same way they went in. Let's talk a little bit about Cherry Road and how this applies in that situation. So these firefighters are wearing full turnout gear. They're at the top of the stairs. When they enter from the outside, their gear is relatively cool. They have that bidirectional flow path. That cold air is flowing past them the entire time. Just as hot air heats you up faster, when you have that cold air flowing past you along the floor of the fire, it's pulling away some of that energy from your gear. So when they enter, basically they have zero visibility. The temperatures inside of that house are certainly warmer than the outside. That heat transfer process begins. They have zero visibility. They're at the top of the stairs. When that basement door is broken out, that basement slider, the temperature begins to increase. The visibility remains zero. Why? Because there's no air at the top of the stairs. There's incredibly high temperatures, but no flames. That's when that heat transfer process begins. They enter zero visibility, the flow path changes, they still don't see anything. So the outside of their gear begins to heat up. Now the size of the fire increases below them very rapidly. They still don't see anything. Now the air is moving past them at a rapid rate. Now it's high temperatures, and the next layer of their gear warms up very quickly too, and the next layer, the next layer, the next layer. They still don't see any flames. There's no oxygen there. So by the time it reaches the skin up against the gear, it hits them all at once. You start to realize you're getting burned. It happens very, very rapidly. Like I said, the people who have lived through it says it's like being stung by 1,000 bees all at once. It hits you very, very hard. When that happens, all you want to do is try to get out of there. But in this case and in San Francisco, they make it a few steps and they collapse. It hits them very, very fast. So how do we protect ourselves from these flow paths, from these situations? Well, we can't put ourselves from where the fire is, where the fire wants to go. You can't put yourself in the outlet because these conditions can change and these firefighters aren't realizing it. We have very, very good gear, but we need to realize when we're in a bad situation. Throughout this entire lesson, we reviewed a number of line of duty death incidents that resulted from unidirectional flow paths. And we've told you that when you create an opening above the fire, that's going to create an outflow. And if you enter through that outflow, you're putting yourself between where the fire is and where that fire wants to go. Now, what we're going to talk about now is vent, enter, search. And it's something that we think can be a good tactic to use if you have a known life hazard. It's a great tactic to search. But inherently, in almost every situation, when you vent, enter, search, you're making an opening above the fire. You're going to create an outlet. That's why we added that isolate part. And when I say we, I don't mean ATF. I mean the fire service in general. Vent, enter, isolate, search. That isolate is critical because most of the time when we vent, enter, search, we're going to vent, enter, search a second floor. Why? Or first floor. That's where the bedrooms are. They're typically located up high in houses. So when we're pushing vent, enter, search, we also want to remember that isolate portion of it. When we create that opening up high, this flow is going to follow that opening. We have an opening high. Those gases are warm. They're more buoyant. That's where they're going to want to go. And every single time you create that opening up high, that's where those gases are going to want to go, up and out that opening. You have cold air coming in along the floor. It becomes heated from the fire, and it goes out the opening you created. That's where the fire is going to want to go, right to where you are. So what do you do to combat that? Well, to combat it, the best thing to do is put something in between you and the fire. In almost every bedroom, you have that hollow core door. And the test that we've done at ATF, the test that UL has done, it should buy you at least 5 minutes of time. Why? You're blocking that flow path, you're limiting the amount of ventilation, and you're putting a barrier between where the fire is and where it wants to go. We've had full-scale fire tests with a hollow core door where that door has lasted over 20 minutes. So that isolate portion is critical. If you have a basement fire, you can bypass an entire first floor, which is important because you have no reliable indicators of collapse by vent, enter, searching that second floor. This is an image from a fire in a 2-story house. The fire appears to be on the first floor. And if we vent, enter, search this house, we break out a window on the second floor, we're creating an opening above that fire. Why is that dangerous? When we create that opening above the fire, we're going to create a unidirectional flow path to where we are and where the person is we're searching for. What's critical? Shutting that door. We break the window. The first thing you want to do is make sure there's a floor there. Do a quick search and make a priority to shut that door. When you shut that door, what does that do? It allows the smoke to exhaust out of that room so you can perform a faster and safer search. It also buys you time. It blocks that flow path. It blocks the opening you just created by breaking that window. In Baltimore County, what did the truck company do? Once they broke the window, they shut the door. They opened the door, assessed conditions, and searched the rest of the house, but they shut the door behind them. By doing that, that provided them a safe area when they found the second victim in that room to pull the victim back out to that bedroom. They had all the time they needed to get the person out. It works very well. Remember to shut that door. This was given to me by a student in one of our classes. This was a fire in Boston, Massachusetts. It was a college student. It was a college housing. I believe it was off campus. And the fire started somewhere, I believe, on the second floor. These people were inside of this bedroom. There's a person inside of this bedroom. When the fire started, they shut the door and they left their door open. There's a person who ended up dying in this unit. These 2 people made it out because they shut the door. They opened the door. They were met by a wall of smoke. They shut it. What did this look like when the fire department arrived? This is a room where the person died. This is a room where the 2 people bailed out. They were rescued by the ladder. The difference between life and death is shutting a single door. It'll buy you, in most of our tests and all of our tests, at least 5 minutes of time to block that flow path, to get yourself out. Shut the door, put something in between you and the fire. This is a fire that occurred just a few months ago in Los Angeles. It's a high-rise fire. Why is this important? It's for 2 reasons. The first reason is it was an exterior attack. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But they ended up putting this fire out from the neighboring unit by putting water in it. They didn't push fire anywhere. This fire actually started, this is all one unit here. The fire started in this unit back on this side in the kitchen area. What happened was the fire basically burned out. It ran out of fuel in this room, and it went down the hallway. There's a bedroom in between here and here. This is a bedroom. That was a hollow core door that remained shut the entire time. Everything in this room was pretty much pristine, even though this went through complete burnout. It burned for over a half an hour, and the fire never made it to this room because that door was shut. It bypassed this room and went to this room and burned again for 20 minutes. Everything was clean in that room. Everything was pristine because that one door was shut. We see it time and time again in cases we look at it. That door is shut, you limit the oxygen, you block the flow path, you buy yourself time. It makes sense. So here at ATF, we've done a number of door tests, hollow core door tests in particular. What do we mean by that? Where if we shut the door, we're preventing fire spread to the rest of the house, also smoke spread as well. How much time does that buy us? Anywhere from 6 to 20 minutes in a lot of our cases. UL has done similar tests using their own furnace that they use for fire-rated assemblies, and they got similar failure times. Usually at least around 5 minutes for that door to fail. If you're an occupant, if you shut that door, it provides you time. If you're a firefighter and you're in a bad situation, close that door. If you're doing a search and you close that door, it buys you an area of refuge. If conditions get bad, you can open that door and shut it again, and it gives you time to bail out. It blocks the flow path. It can create ventilation-limited conditions. It can give you an area of refuge. So what have we talked about today? Well, we talked about unidirectional flow paths, how to recognize them, why they're so dangerous, and what you can do about them. The best thing to do is to attack the fire from the inlet. Now, if you have that unidirectional flow, it always means there's an inlet somewhere else, and it's typically the lowest point. So if there's a unidirectional flow outward somewhere, there's got to be an inlet. That's the best place to flow water. If you try to combat that unidirectional flow with a hand line, you're not going to make much leeway. Why? You're not cooling the source of all that energy. And we'll show you some videos of that in the next series. Conversely, if you use that flow path to your advantage, flow water in through the inlet, things get better very, very fast. What else do we learn? Well, if the fire's below grade, and every one of these line of duty death incidents had fires below grade. Why? Because that's when these flow paths develop. Anytime you have an opening low and an opening high, you're gonna have this flow path develop. Almost every single fire we run, we have an opening low and an opening high. This is why it's so important. So if fire is below grade, attack the fire from an exterior vent or exterior entrance if possible. It makes sense. If no vent exists, then that flow cannot be unidirectional. What do I mean by that? If this is a basement and there's absolutely no window or door, then the only way this fire can get air is through that opening that you entered. So when you enter that front door, the only way that fire can get air is coming down the stairs. It's a bidirectional flow. So if that opening does not exist at the grade level, then you can't have that unidirectional flow up the stairs. So we'll talk a lot more in this next video series about tactics, ventilation tactics and suppression tactics. Now, flames cannot be pushed. You cannot push fire, and UL has done literally hundreds of tests to verify this. And what they've shown is that when you flow water on the seat of the fire, the temperatures drop throughout the entire flow path. So what does that mean? Whether it's on the interior or exterior, if you put water in the fire, things improve throughout the house. So if you have a working basement fire, working fire below grade, the best thing you can do is apply water to the seat of the fire. When they had the Mayday situation in Prince George's County on 57th Avenue, they applied water to the seat of the fire, and things certainly did not get worse. All indications they got better. And every test that UL has done, the same thing has been true. If you put water on the seat of the fire, things get better throughout. What are we going to talk about now? Well, we've talked about unidirectional flows, smoke and flames. You have to compartmentalize yourself. Close the door, try to get out of that flow path, whether it's in a dead-end room, and call for help early. If things start getting worse, if the smoke is very, very turbulent, if it's moving past you at a high rate, you can open your hand line to cool things. It's probably not going to put out the fire, but if you absorb the energy, things will get better. You need to block that flow path. Put a door between you and the fire. That will buy you a significant amount of time. If you're doing a search and you close doors as you go, especially if you're breaking windows, you're blocking that outlet that you just created. It also gives you an area of refuge. If you shut that door, it'll buy you several minutes. So we've learned that the majority of the fires that we run, or with ATF that we investigate, they're ventilation limited. If that smoke layer is from floor to ceiling, the more you ventilate, the bigger the fire is going to get. Always, 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 unless you put water on it. So in this video, we've talked a lot about ventilation flow paths, a lot about ventilation limited fires, and a lot of science. We're going to apply all of these concepts with actual fire tests in the third video. It's going to be a lot of actual tests, a lot of actual fire scenarios where we illustrate horizontal ventilation, positive pressure ventilation, as well as interior attack versus exterior attack. So all these concepts that we've applied, all these scientific concepts, we're going to see firsthand. And that's when we really start to sink in. That's when we understand the information. So I wanted to thank Steve Lohr, Chief Steve Lohr, one more time for having me out here, as well as ATF. And I'll see you guys in this third video where we'll tie all these concepts together into one final product. Thank you very much.